policy and criminal justice policy in the United States. Now is such a really great time for you all to be coming to Washington to learn about these issues of racism and racial disparity within the criminal justice system. Just this month, a number of bills have been introduced in Congress looking at disproportionality in sentencing policy at the federal level, bills looking at trying to address mass incarceration at the state level by providing financial incentives for states. So it's, despite a lot of the rhetoric that has been harmful on this issue coming from the administration, that stoked fears about rising crime rates and trying to sort of target communities of color and immigrant communities in particular for those, their belief of a significant rise in violent crime. There continues to be, as there has been for a number of years, bipartisan support for criminal justice reform, both at the federal and state level. So I'm really excited that you all are committed to this issue and interested in learning more about it, and willing to come to the Capitol Hill and talk with your lawmakers about why you care about race and mass incarceration issues. So I have a brief PowerPoint that I wanted to share with you, just as sort of a way to sort of more easily explain some of the statistics and data around these issues. This first picture here actually was one that was taken just this spring, actually in May. I participated with a lot of my colleagues here in Washington, and a number of people in the vibrant faith community doing advocacy around criminal justice reform in Washington gathered in front of the Department of Justice. That's what this is a picture of. It was a rally that happened a few days after Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued an executive order revoking what was called the Smart on Crime Initiative. That was an initiative that was introduced by then Attorney General Eric Holder, that urged prosecutors, federal prosecutors in U.S. attorney offices around the country to deprioritize low-level drug cases in their prosecutions, urging them not to, in those cases, to use low mandatory minimums when they were not necessary. As a result, since that initiative began about, I guess now 3 years ago, there had been an important decline in the prosecution of low-level drug cases. Not that those cases weren't being punished, but they were not. They were either being transferred to the state level, or the folks were not receiving mandatory minimums. So when Attorney General Sessions was nominated and confirmed, his philosophy is very different from that of the previous administration and the previous attorneys general, including Holder and Loretta Lynch, who succeeded him. Their priority has been signaling to prosecutors and directing prosecutors to bring the longest sentences and the most serious charges in cases. They have really, they have also signaled that they're going to bring more prosecutions for immigration offenses, which includes illegal reentry, crossing the border, and other immigration offenses. So there is definitely a concern in Washington, as is represented in that photo, among the advocacy community, the criminal justice reform advocacy community, that there will be a ramp up, not just in prosecutions, but in resulting incarceration because of the ramp up of that Sessions wants. So the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons at the federal level, is already overcrowded, and we anticipate that increased prosecutions and the increased incarceration that results will mean more overcrowding, more use of private prisons, and still a disproportionate number of people of color being incarcerated for these offenses, and also disproportionately low-level people being incarcerated for those offenses. So there's a robust conversation happening now in Washington, and I'm looking forward to having you all join us. So I'm just going to start out sort of giving you the Criminal Justice 101 sort of explanation, and I'm happy to take questions at the end because I'm going to go rather quickly through this. So the United States, as probably most of you know, hopefully now you'll know, is a world leader in incarceration. We incarcerate the largest number of people in the world. We also have among the highest rates of incarceration in the world. About 2.2 million people are in prisons and jails. This graph that you're looking at now represents people who were incarcerated in prisons, both federal and state prisons, over the last almost century. And you can see that our sort of status as world leader in incarceration wasn't always the case. Our use of incarceration is a relatively new phenomenon. You know, up until the early 1970s, levels of incarceration were relatively flat. Around the mid to late 1970s is when it started to take off and obviously continued to increase exponentially over the following 40 years or so. So one might say, well, what was going on in the mid to late 70s that sort of changed things? And one of those things was the advent of the war on drugs. There was increased concern about drug use nationally, and there was also some increases in violent crime during that time. The increases in incarceration, though, over the last 40 years, it's important to know, don't necessarily reflect a 40 years. They do not reflect 40-year increases in crime. That increase in incarceration is the result of changes in policy, both at the federal and the state level. We have had, for the last 20 years, a huge drop in crime. Crime rates probably peaked, the height of the crime rates probably peaked in the early 1990s. And since then have been on the decline. And we can, even now, despite what you might hear from the Attorney General and from the President, we still, as a country, nationally, enjoy some of the lowest crime rates we ever had since crime rates have been recorded. And that includes violent crime. Now, there are certain cities where violent crime is definitely on the rise, and it's very troubling. But those are really not emblematic of a national trend. At least we don't think so as of yet, because it's only been about 2 years since we've seen those increases. And 2 years does not make a trend. Certainly not when you're comparing that to a 20-year decline in crime. So we're trying to remain optimistic. We certainly think violent crime needs to be addressed, and particularly in localities that have seen upticks. But we don't think it's the trend that the administration is sort of been articulating in the press. So as you can see, mass incarceration has been growing for the last 40 years. Fortunately, for the last 6 years or so, we have plateaued in incarceration rates, and actually have had a small decline in the single digits, but a decline nonetheless, and I welcome that. But there's still so much more to do. We have, even with that decline, we have very high rates of incarceration. About 670 people are incarcerated in the United States per population of per 100,000 people population. That is, should trouble all of us. People who, because it doesn't just end with people who are incarcerated. We have nearly 60 to 70 million people in this country who have a criminal record, about 30 million people who have a felony criminal record, and those records stay with them for a lifetime. Your incarceration or your sentence is not the end of the story. Criminal records can bar you from a whole host of benefits, and also there's significant bias associated with people who have criminal records, regardless of how many years have passed since their sentence was completed. So for people who have criminal records who are out living in the community, may not be able to vote. They may not be able to qualify for food stamps or TANF benefits. They may not be able to find employment either because of licensing requirements or because of stigma from employers. They may not be able to find access to they may not be able to get access to public housing. They may not be able to qualify for financial aid for college. There's a whole host of collateral consequences associated with criminal record, and that's part of the reason why addressing mass incarceration is so critical, because the problem of people's entanglement with the criminal justice system really stays with them for a lifetime. But I really want to get into the specifics of racial and ethnic disparity in the criminal justice system, because race and ethnicity, you can't talk about the criminal justice system without talking about race and ethnicity. And the huge disparity and burden community of colors experience from the criminal justice system. It would be a disingenuous conversation to talk about incarceration, not talk about these issues. So from this chart, you can see, Black men, we have a national rate, as I said earlier, of incarceration of 670 people per 100,000. African American men, their incarceration rate is 2,613 per 100,000. Their incarceration far outpaces that of white men and also Latino men. But Latino men also have a very significant ethnic and racial disparity in their rates of incarceration. You can see among women there also is racial disparity. There are significantly fewer women who are incarcerated than men. About 10% of people who are in prison are men. I'm sorry, about 10% of the incarcerated population are women. The rest are men, but among women there still remains significant racial disparity in who goes there. So I think this next chart is really important to look at sort of the real on-the-ground consequences of racial disparity. So this infographic looks at all people born in 2001 in the United States and compares their likelihood of imprisonment during their lifetime. So a Black male born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance of spending some time in incarceration during his lifetime. That is an astounding statistic. For Latino men, it's 1 in 6. For white men, it's 1 in 17. Those are unprecedented rates of incarceration that you really, as a country, we need to grapple with. Because behind those individuals are entire families, communities that are also impacted by incarceration. And because someone's entanglement with the criminal justice system is lifelong, the impact is also lifelong on their families and communities. So I know that in your work, or the issues you plan to discuss at the lobby day, you're going to be talking soup to nuts on criminal justice reform, both entry into the system through arrest and policing and the court process, as well as incarceration, but also looking at once people come home. And I think that's really critically important. This is just one example of the collateral consequences I mentioned before and how there's racial disparity associated with it. So one of our priority issues at the Sentencing Project for a number of years now has been trying to address voting rights for people with convicted of felony convictions and the myriad of state laws that address this issue. So 48 states and the District of Columbia disenfranchise people from voting if they have a felony record. The 2 states that don't are Maine and Vermont. So in Maine and Vermont, you can vote if you're in prison. Everywhere else, if you are incarcerated for a felony conviction, you cannot vote. And then the policies shift by state. Some states about 14 states restore voting rights once people leave incarceration. Another about 34 states, and then it goes up from there. Many states restore, I think about 34 states restore voting rights after completion of sentence, which would include probation and parole. There are 4 states that have permanent lifetime bans on voting. and that is Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, and Virginia. There are, no, I think, about 10 states that also have some level of lifetime ban for at least some people. So on this chart, you can see on the left the total disenfranchisement rate. These are statistics are from 2016. About 6.1 million people in the United States are barred from voting because of their conviction. And you can see state by state where it's most prevalent, where disenfranchisement is the worst. And the darker the color of the state, the worse the disenfranchisement is. But I think it's important to look at this map also with the one on the right, which looks at African American disenfranchisement and how much brighter and darker it is. Rates of disenfranchisement for African Americans are significantly worse, significantly higher. I mean, states like Florida, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, up to 20% of the African American population in those states cannot vote because of their felony records. That is a huge proportion of the African American population not being able to participate in the electoral process. Just think how devastating that is to the families they represent, the communities they represent, and their interests that are being denied a voice at the ballot box. And that's not just for federal elections, right? That's for school board. That's for your local mayor and your city council member. That means a parent who has a child in school can't weigh in on the policy decisions of the school board. They're really sort of micro, day-to-day, meat and potatoes kind of issues that people are not allowed to have a voice on because of a felony conviction. And in states like Florida, that's the rest of their life unless they get a pardon from the governor. So really important issues. And this is just one example of it. So I do want to spend a fair amount of time on how we can address the issue, how we can address these problems, because that's why presumably you're coming to Washington to learn, but also to use your knowledge and take steps to advocate for reform. And you all have, I've looked over your talking points, have a really ambitious agenda, and I think it's fantastic. There really is so much that needs to be done to address the system. I should say it can't all happen at the federal level and at Congress. A lot of it also needs to happen at the state level. So I encourage you to also use what you learned from this webinar and what you learned from the conference to take it home, to talk to your local lawmakers, your state lawmakers about need to reform the criminal justice system. So I've here sort of tried to represent sort of the issue areas that you're going to be covering and hope to address. And I don't know if you'll have enough time to cover all of them, or if you will pick or choose. I guess that's a question for Kim, and how best people should navigate all the different issues to cover. But you know, the first talking point, the first bullet point there talks about fair policing practices. You know, obviously there has been much attention to the excessive use of force by police officers used against African Americans, African American men, and the alarming number of killings that have happened against unarmed men. And there's been a huge backlash. And obviously right now this is part of the conversation with the NFL protests, because it is such a long existing problem of racial profiling and policing practices in communities of color. So I was just going to recommend, you know, this is a comprehensive problem, and I know you want comprehensive solutions. I've just on this slide incorporate a couple of possible bills for you to know about that address components of the problem. And one of them is the End Racial Profiling Act, and the other is the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. Both of those are sponsored by John Conyers in the House, who's a Michigan Democrat and ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee, and Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. He is also he is the lead sponsor in the Senate for those two police reform bills. And Racial Profiling Act is primarily a data bill. It's been around for over 10 years. They've been trying to get that bill through Congress just to collect data on stops and arrests and data on racial and ethnic breakdown of people police are stopping. It's been hard to get movement on that, but something that's so critically important to have, because if we have data and information, our arguments are enhanced and we have more evidence to point to for the need for reform. The Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act provides law enforcement with resources. It would set up an accreditation programming and training programming with the idea of trying to improve relationships between communities and increase trust with law enforcement. There's also one of the other next on the list. You're looking at the judicial proceeding process. I guess that has to do with access to lawyers, fairness in the court system, and also pretrial, how individuals are treated. So there actually is a bill that's out there, a bipartisan bill that was introduced in the Senate by Kamala Harris, Senator from California, and Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, called the Pretrial Integrity and Safety Act, which tries to address money bail issues and encourages states to do away with money bail so that people are not kept incarcerated pre-trial simply because they cannot afford to pay their bail. We know from statistics that people of color in particular are more likely to be incarcerated pre-trial, and people who are incarcerated pre-trial are more likely to be convicted and sentenced to prison than people who are able to get out pre-trial and continue working and maintaining relationships with their families. So it's gotten a lot of that issue's got a lot of traction in a number of states, particularly New Jersey a number of years ago passed an important bail reform legislation, and I know this Harris-Paul bill has gotten a lot of attention, particularly because it's bipartisan, but is getting at an issue that typically Congress has not looked at, which is local bail issues, but really important because we don't want people incarcerated simply because they're too poor to pay to get out. Next on the list is sentencing reform issues. Just this month, Congress, bipartisan legislation was introduced in the Senate. One is the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, introduced by Charles Grassley of Iowa, who's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. That would provide more discretion to judges in sentencing folks below mandatory minimums for low-level drug offenses. It would also eliminate the 3 strikes and you're out for lifer penalty for drug offenses. It would cap life. It would get rid of the mandatory minimum for life and create a 25-year mandatory minimum. It would also make those changes retroactive, which is pretty important, particularly for people who are now there's several thousand people in federal prison serving life without parole for nonviolent drug offenses who will die in prison without a retroactivity provision. Another good sentencing reform bill that was introduced this month is the Smarter Sentencing Act, also sponsored by Senator Durbin, and on the Republican side, Mike Lee from Utah. That would cut in half mandatory minimums for drug offenses, would have a really profound effect on the numbers of people going in and staying in federal prison. So really important piece of legislation. And finally, on the collateral consequences and reducing barriers for people with criminal convictions, two good bills to look at are the REDEEM Act, which was introduced by Senator Paul from Kentucky again and Cory Booker from New Jersey. The REDEEM Act is the Record Expungement Designed to Enhance Employment Act. It's a pretty comprehensive bill, despite what its title implies. It does expunge the record for some people, certain kinds of offenses, primarily very low-level nonviolent offenses, after a certain amount of time. It would also clean up the FBI database around fingerprints. It would bar solitary confinement for juveniles. It would also create an expungement program for juveniles, and it would restore would end the lifetime ban on TANF and food stamps at the federal level because of drug convictions. So a really important piece of legislation that I hope you would look at. Also, the Democracy Restoration Act, which is another bill by John Conyers in the House and Ben Cardin in the Senate, would restore federal voting rights in federal elections for people who have completed their sentence after incarceration and probation and parole. So, really great agenda that you have lined up for November. Really important points, I think, that you all are going to be covering. And I really am excited to come to the conference, talk to some of you there, and hear about all the great progress you make in talking to members on the Hill. So I know I wanted to allow some time for questions. So I think I should probably pause now and let's do that.
Folks, so I am about to unmute you. So if you're not muted on your phone right now and want to be, this is your chance to do it. Okay, you are all unmuted. Any questions? If you're unable to get sound through the way you're connected as well, feel free to use the chat function and we can relay the question.
I see a blinking light under chat, I think. Okay, I think I see a question from Jessica. Should I read that out, Kim?
Yeah, perfect.
Which one of the acts that you discussed have the most likelihood of being passed? So that's a really great question. I would say that of the bills I mentioned, the one with the most sort of bipartisan consensus around happening right now is the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act that was introduced just this month by Chairman Grassley from Iowa and Dick Durbin. There have been some conversations, I know, at the White House about that bill. Jared Kushner, who is the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, has expressed some interest in the bill. As you may or may not know, his father was incarcerated in federal prison several years ago, and actually criminal justice reform is an issue that's pretty important to him. And he's convened a number of events both at the White House and at his home. I know just last week he invited a bipartisan group of senators to talk about criminal justice reform, including sentencing issues. And so the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, although it is very much a compromise piece of legislation. It's not going to end racial disparity, it's not going to end mass incarceration, but it is certainly an important step forward and worth you all taking a look at and talking about.
Any other questions? All right, well, I wanted to thank you, Kara, for taking the time to put together this presentation and to be with us today. I think you gave a really great intro to criminal justice and how race plays into the criminal justice system. So thank you again for being with us today. This is being recorded and will be shared with the entire teach-in list. So if folks on this call want to check back for some notes, you'll also be able to look back at the recording. We'll also post that the slides that Kara shared as well, so you can reference those charts. So thanks again, everyone, for being a part of this, and we'll see you in November. Take care all.